In the suffocating heat of a Virginia summer in 1856, there existed a man whose very appearance defied the cruel logic of slavery. His skin, pale as moonlight, burned under the same sun that bronzed his fellow enslaved people. His hair, white as cotton bolls waiting to be picked, marked him as different in a world that punished difference with particular cruelty. His eyes, light and searching, saw the same chains, the same whips, the same endless fields that stretched toward a horizon he was forbidden to reach. They called him Samuel, not because it was the name his mother whispered to him in those first precious moments of life, but because it was the name his master chose, a biblical name for a man who would learn that even God's favor could not protect him from the violence of men who claimed to speak in God's name. If you're drawn to stories of resilience against impossible odds, hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more untold histories that deserve to be remembered, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Samuel belonged to Robert Whitmore, a plantation owner whose wealth was measured in acres of tobacco and the bodies of those who worked them. Whitmore was not the cruelest master in Henrico County, a distinction that meant little when cruelty was the foundation upon which the entire system stood. He did not whip his enslaved people daily. He did not starve them to the edge of death. He did not sell children from their mother's arms except when debts demanded it. These absences of extreme brutality in the twisted arithmetic of slavery were counted as kindness. But Samuel's albinism inspired in Whitmore something worse than routine cruelty. It inspired fascination. From the moment Samuel was born on Whitmore's plantation in 1831, he was treated as an oddity. As a child, he was brought into the main house more frequently than other enslaved children, displayed before visitors like a rare specimen. Whitmore's wife would run her fingers through Samuel's white hair and marvel at its texture, while their guests debated whether he was fully human or some curiosity of nature. Samuel stood silent during these examinations, learning early that his body was not his own, that even his appearance was property to be discussed and examined without his consent. The other enslaved people on the plantation treated Samuel with a mixture of protectiveness and unease. His mother, Dinah, kept him close when she could, applying poultices to his burned skin after long days in the fields. She taught him to cover himself, to seek shade, to move through the world as invisibly as his visible difference would allow, but even her fierce love could not shield him from the isolation his appearance created. Some of the older enslaved people whispered that his white skin was a sign, though whether it portended fortune or doom, no one could agree. A few kept their distance, as if his difference might be contagious, but most simply saw him as one of their own, marked by the same chains and subject to the same master, regardless of the color of his skin. As Samuel grew, so did Whitmore's obsession with him. The master began to see Samuel not just as property, but as proof of his own theories about race and heredity. Whitmore fancied himself a man of science, a reader of phrenology texts and racial treatises that purported to explain the natural order of human hierarchy. Samuel became his personal experiment, a living contradiction to examine and explain. Whitmore would summon Samuel to his study, measuring the circumference of his head, the length of his limbs, documenting every physical characteristic in leather-bound journals. He would question Samuel about his thoughts, his dreams, whether he felt different from the other enslaved people. Samuel learned to answer carefully, to give responses that satisfied Whitmore's curiosity without revealing the fury that built like pressure behind his ribs. Because Samuel did feel different, not in the way Whitmore imagined, but in his growing understanding that his uniqueness gave him a strange, precarious power. Whitmore was fascinated by him. That fascination, Samuel began to realize, was a weakness. The plantation operated according to rhythms as old as the institution itself. Dawn came with the ringing of the bell that called enslaved people to the fields. Tobacco plants stretched in endless rows, their broad leaves demanding constant attention. Planting in spring, suckering through summer, harvesting in fall, preparing the soil in winter. The cycle repeated without mercy, without rest, without hope of change. Samuel worked alongside the others, though his burned skin made the labor agony. The overseer, a man named Garrett, whose enjoyment of violence was barely contained by Whitmore's orders for restraint, watched Samuel with particular attention. Garrett resented the way Whitmore treated Samuel as special, the way the master would pull Samuel from field work to conduct his examinations and studies. To Garrett, Samuel was getting above himself, forgetting his place. It was Garrett who delivered the worst of Samuel's beatings, not the casual violence of maintaining discipline, but calculated punishment designed to remind Samuel that whatever interest Whitmore showed him, he was still property, still subject to the whip, still less than human in the eyes of those who claimed dominion over him. One beating in particular became the turning point. Though Samuel would not recognize it as such for months to come, it was August 1855, and Samuel was 24 years old. He had been sent to the main house to be measured for a new suit of clothes. Whitmore planned to take him to Richmond, to present him before a gathering of gentlemen interested in scientific discussions of race. Samuel stood in the parlor while the tailor worked, aware of Whitmore's wife watching from her chair, fanning herself against the heat. "Does it hurt?" she asked suddenly. "Your skin, I mean, in the sun." Samuel kept his eyes lowered, as he had been trained to do. "Yes, ma'am." "How fascinating," she murmured, as if he had described the sensation of a mildly interesting insect bite, rather than the constant agony of his existence. When Samuel returned to the quarters that evening, Garrett was waiting. He had heard that Samuel was being taken to Richmond, that Whitmore planned to show him off in the city. The overseer's face was red with rage, though whether at Samuel or at his own irrelevance, Samuel could not tell. "Think you're special, don't you?" Garrett hissed, grabbing Samuel by the shirt. "Think that white skin makes you better than the rest of these niggers?" Samuel said nothing, which was the wrong response. Silence could be interpreted as defiance, as agreement, as contempt. There was no right response. Garrett's whip opened the skin of Samuel's back in stripes that would scar white against white, invisible to casual observers, but felt in every movement for weeks afterward. The other enslaved people watched from their cabin doors, unable to intervene, their faces reflecting both sympathy and relief that the violence was directed at someone else. But something broke in Samuel that night, or perhaps something solidified. As he lay face down on the rough boards of the cabin floor while Dinah cleaned his wounds, he made a decision. He did not articulate it, even to himself, but his body understood what his mind had not yet accepted. He would not die on this plantation. He would not live his entire life as Whitmore's specimen, Garrett's target, a curiosity to be examined and discussed. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, he would be free. The trip to Richmond came 2 weeks later. Samuel's back had healed enough that he could wear the new suit without blood seeping through. Whitmore brought him to a meeting of the Virginia Scientific Society, held in a gentleman's club that reeked of tobacco smoke and bourbon. Samuel stood on a raised platform while Whitmore lectured about racial characteristics, about the accident of pigmentation that had created Samuel's condition, about what his existence proved about the fundamental differences between races. The assembled gentlemen nodded and took notes, asked questions about Samuel's intelligence, his temperament, whether he could read, whether he experienced normal human emotions. Samuel answered when addressed, his voice level and calm, but his mind was working, observing, calculating. He noted the streets they had traveled to reach this place. He memorized the layout of the building, the locations of doors and windows. He listened to the conversations around him, picking up fragments of information about the city, about escape routes, about the underground networks that some whispered about in coded language. When they returned to the plantation, Samuel began to prepare. Not obviously, he could not risk Garrett's suspicion or Whitmore's attention, but in small ways he gathered what he would need. A knife stolen from the main house kitchen, hidden in the dirt floor of his cabin. Bits of food dried and stored. Knowledge accumulated from overheard conversations, from the occasional enslaved person who had attempted escape and been dragged back, broken and defeated. Winter came, and with it the bitter cold that Samuel's pale skin seemed to feel more acutely than others. He worked through the preparation of fields for next season's planting, his hands cracked and bleeding, his body aching with cold and exhaustion, but inside he was warm with purpose. He began to study Whitmore with the same attention Whitmore had always studied him. He learned the master's routines, his habits, his weaknesses. He learned that Whitmore kept a pistol in his desk drawer, that he drank heavily most evenings, that he had recently borrowed significant sums of money to expand his holdings. And Samuel learned something else, something that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. Whitmore had been conducting an affair with the wife of his business partner, a man named Charles Henley, who owned the adjacent plantation. The affair was poorly hidden. Several enslaved people knew of it, having carried messages or witnessed encounters in the woods between the two properties. This knowledge sat in Samuel's mind like a coal, growing hotter with time, not because he cared about the moral failings of his master, but because he understood that dangerous secrets were leverage, and Samuel needed all the leverage he could gather. Spring of 1856 arrived with brutal heat. Samuel's 25th birthday came and went unmarked except by Dinah, who managed to save him a small piece of cornbread from her rations. He thanked her and ate it slowly, tasting both her love and his own determination. The catalyzing moment came in June. Whitmore announced he was selling Dinah, not because she had done anything wrong, not because she was unproductive, but because Charles Henley had offered a good price for an experienced house servant, and Whitmore needed the money. The fact that this sale would separate mother from son was irrelevant. The fact that Dinah had served the Whitmore family for 30 years meant nothing. She was property, and property could be liquidated when circumstances demanded. Samuel received this news in Whitmore's study, where he had been summoned for one of the master's periodic examinations. Whitmore delivered the information casually, almost as an afterthought, while measuring the distance between Samuel's eyes with calipers. "Your mother will go to the Henley place next week," Whitmore said. "It's not far, perhaps you'll see her occasionally." Samuel's hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists. His breath came shallow and quick. Behind his light eyes, something ancient and terrible awakened. Not rage exactly, but a cold clarity that made rage look like a weak and useless emotion. "Do you understand?" Whitmore asked, noticing Samuel's silence. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, his voice steady. "I understand perfectly." And he did. He understood that Whitmore saw him as nothing more than an object of study. He understood that even Whitmore's fascination with him was a form of violence, that every measurement and question and examination had been an assertion of absolute power. He understood that there was no appeal to be made, no mercy to be found, no future except the one he created for himself. That night, Samuel made his final preparations. Tomorrow he would act. The dawn that broke over Whitmore's plantation on June 17, 1856, appeared no different from any other. The bell rang at the same hour. The enslaved people shuffled from their cabins toward the fields with the same exhausted resignation. The tobacco plants stood in their rows, indifferent to the human drama unfolding around them. But Samuel moved through this familiar choreography with the knowledge that everything was about to change. He had not slept. His mind had been too active, reviewing his plan, identifying its weaknesses, accepting its risks. The knife was hidden in his waistband, pressed against his skin like a cold promise. He had eaten nothing. His stomach was too tight with anticipation to accept food. Dinah had tried to make him take some cornmeal mush, but he had refused gently, unable to meet her eyes, afraid she would see his intentions written across his face. The morning proceeded according to routine. Samuel worked his section of the field, his movements automatic after years of repetition, but he positioned himself carefully, keeping track of where Garrett supervised, where the other enslaved people worked, where he could move without drawing attention. The sun climbed higher, and Samuel felt its familiar burn on his exposed skin. But today the pain seemed distant, as if his body already understood it would not have to endure this particular suffering much longer. At midday, when the heat became unbearable, and even Garrett allowed a brief rest, Samuel made his move. He did not run. Running would have been noticed immediately, would have brought Garrett and his whip and his dogs. Instead, Samuel walked with purpose toward the tree line, as if heading to relieve himself in the woods. It was a common enough occurrence that no one called out to stop him. Once in the cover of trees, Samuel moved quickly. He knew these woods. Every enslaved person on the plantation knew them, having been sent to gather firewood, to hunt small game, to perform the 100 tasks that required venturing beyond the cultivated fields. Samuel moved toward the stream that marked the boundary between Whitmore's land and Henley's, following it upstream toward the place where the two masters sometimes met to discuss business. There was a small cabin near this boundary, a rough structure used for storing tools, and sometimes for the private meetings Whitmore thought were secret. Samuel had been sent there before to deliver items, and he had seen enough to understand what those meetings truly were. The cabin was where Whitmore met with Margaret Henley, away from the eyes of both households, away from the judgment of a society that would condemn their affair, even as it tolerated every other form of violence and exploitation. Samuel reached the cabin just after noon. He could hear voices inside, Whitmore's low rumble and Margaret's higher tones, though he could not make out words. He circled the structure quietly, noting that Whitmore's horse was tied nearby, that there was only one entrance, that the windows were shuttered against the heat and prying eyes. This was the moment. Everything that came after would be consequence and chaos, but this moment was choice. Samuel could still turn back, could still return to the fields and live out his days as Whitmore's curiosity and Garrett's target. He could still be the dutiful slave, the fascinating specimen, the man who knew his place, but Dinah would still be sold, and Samuel would still burn under the sun, and nothing would ever change, except that he would grow old in chains, his uniqueness offering no protection, his difference only isolating him further from both the enslaved and the free. Samuel pulled the knife from his waistband and approached the cabin door. He did not kick it open with dramatic force. He simply opened it, as any enslaved person might open any door on the plantation, with the assumption that his presence would be tolerated if not welcomed. The hinges creaked, light spilled into the dim interior, and Whitmore and Margaret Henley looked up from their embrace, their faces shifting from surprise to confusion to fear in the space of a heartbeat. "Samuel?" Whitmore said, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment, as if the categories in his mind could not accommodate the sight of his enslaved property standing in the doorway with a knife, interrupting his pleasure. "What are you doing here?" Samuel did not answer immediately. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Margaret made a small sound of distress and clutched at her disheveled clothing. Whitmore's face began to redden with anger, the familiar prelude to violence that Samuel had seen countless times before. "How dare you?" Whitmore began, moving as if to strike Samuel, to reassert the natural order through physical force, but Samuel raised the knife, and Whitmore stopped. For perhaps the first time in their 25 years of master and slave, Whitmore looked at Samuel and saw not a curiosity, not a specimen, not property, but a threat. "Sit down," Samuel said quietly. The tone of his voice, calm, almost conversational, seemed to unnerve Whitmore more than shouting would have. The master sat, pulling Margaret down beside him on the rough bench that served as the cabin's only furniture. They clutched at each other, and Samuel felt a distant satisfaction at seeing them afraid. Not pleasure exactly. He took no joy in their fear, but satisfaction that for once he was the one who inspired terror rather than suffered it. "What do you want?" Whitmore asked, and there was a tremor in his voice that Samuel had never heard before. "Money? I can give you money. Food, supplies, whatever you need to run. Just don't hurt us." Samuel almost laughed. Even now Whitmore thought in terms of transaction, of buying his way out of danger, of maintaining control through negotiation. He did not understand that Samuel had moved beyond the economy of slavery, beyond the system where everything could be purchased and sold. "I don't want your money," Samuel said. "I want a horse. I want 3 days before you raise the alarm, and I want you to free my mother." The last demand seemed to confuse Whitmore most. "Free her. She's already sold to Henley. The transaction is complete." "Then buy her back and free her," Samuel replied. "You're a wealthy man. You can afford it." "That's impossible," Whitmore protested. "Even if I wanted to, and why should I, when you're standing here threatening me with a knife? I can't just free her. There are laws. She would need papers. She would need—" "I don't care about the details," Samuel interrupted. "You're a man of science, remember? A man of learning and influence. Figure it out." Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice high with panic. "He'll kill us anyway, Robert. Once he has what he wants, he'll kill us to keep us from talking." Samuel looked at her, this woman whose moral weakness had given him this opportunity, whose affair with another woman's husband had placed her in this cabin at this moment. "I won't kill you," he said. "I don't want to be a murderer. I just want to stop being a slave." "Then put down the knife," Whitmore urged, seeming to find some confidence in Samuel's declaration. "We can discuss this reasonably. I've always treated you well, haven't I? Better than the others. You've always been special to me." And there it was, the fundamental delusion that allowed Whitmore to sleep peacefully at night. He genuinely believed that his fascination with Samuel, his scientific interest, his occasional kindnesses, constituted good treatment. He could not see that every measurement, every examination, every moment of being made to feel different and strange and less than human had been its own form of torture. "You've treated me like a curiosity," Samuel said, "like something to study and display. You've never treated me like a man. Because you're not—" Whitmore stopped himself, but the damage was done. The rest of the sentence hung in the air, unspoken but understood. "Because you're not a man. Because you're property. Because you're something less, something other, something that exists for my benefit and education." Samuel's grip on the knife tightened. For a moment, he imagined using it, not to kill, but to mark, to make Whitmore understand physically what it felt like to be owned, to be hurt, to be helpless, but he pushed the impulse away. Violence would not free him. Violence would only prove what men like Whitmore already believed about enslaved people, that they were dangerous, savage, requiring the firm hand of control. "Here's what will happen," Samuel said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You're going to write a letter to Charles Henley telling him that you've reconsidered the sale of Dinah, that you're buying her back. You're going to give me your horse and enough supplies for a week's travel. You're going to give me a 3-day head start before you report me missing. And in exchange, I will ride away from here and never speak of what I saw in this cabin." It was blackmail, crude and simple. Samuel was leveraging Whitmore's guilty secret, the affair that would destroy his reputation and business relationships if it became public knowledge. He hated the necessity of it, hated that even in rebellion he had to work within the systems that oppressed him, using scandal and shame as currency because he had no other wealth. Whitmore's face went through several expressions: anger, calculation, fear, resignation. "And if I refuse? Then I walk out of this cabin and tell everyone I meet what I saw here," Samuel replied. "I tell Garrett. I tell the other enslaved people, who will make sure it reaches Charles Henley's ears. I tell your wife, I tell anyone who will listen. And then I run anyway, and you get nothing. No horse returned, no secret kept, no control over the story." Margaret made a sound like a sob. "Robert, give him what he wants, please. Think of my children. Think of Charles. If this becomes known, I'm thinking," Whitmore snapped at her. Though his anger seemed directed more at his own helplessness than at her fear, he looked at Samuel with something like hatred, but also with a terrible understanding. Samuel had learned too well from his master. He had studied power and leverage and control. He had observed how men like Whitmore manipulated the world to their advantage, and now those lessons were being applied in reverse. 3 days, Whitmore finally said. "But I can't free Dinah. I can delay the sale, claim she's needed for some task. I can buy you time. But freeing her would require legal processes I can't complete secretly. Everyone would know. There would be questions." Samuel felt a wave of despair. He had known this was likely, had prepared himself for this outcome, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. His mother would remain enslaved. His resistance would not save her. All he could do was save himself and hope that someday, somehow, he could return for her. "Delay the sale," Samuel agreed, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Keep her here. Don't let Henley take her." "For how long?" Whitmore asked. "Eventually, as long as you can," Samuel interrupted. "That's the deal. The horse, the supplies, 3 days, and you keep my mother here. In exchange, your secret stays secret." Whitmore nodded slowly. Then he stood, moving carefully, keeping his hands visible. "There's paper in that chest," he said, gesturing to a corner of the cabin. "And ink. I'll write the letter to Henley now." Samuel watched as Whitmore composed the message, his handwriting shaky but legible. The letter cited unexpected complications, requested a postponement of the sale, promised to discuss matters in person the following week. It was vague enough to avoid suspicion, but specific enough to accomplish Samuel's goal. When it was done, Whitmore sealed the letter and handed it to Samuel. "My horse is outside. There's food in the saddlebags. I was planning to stay here through the afternoon. Take it all." Samuel took the letter, folding it carefully and tucking it inside his shirt. He moved toward the door, keeping the knife visible, not quite trusting that this was over. Whitmore and Margaret remained seated, watching him with expressions that mingled fear and something like respect. At the threshold, Samuel paused. He wanted to say something profound, something that would articulate all the rage and pain and determination that had brought him to this moment. But words felt inadequate, so he simply said, "Tell Dinah I'm alive. Tell her I'll come back for her. She'll be punished for your escape," Whitmore said. And there was something in his voice, not quite sympathy, but acknowledgement of a cruelty he was about to commit because the system demanded it. "They'll assume she knew, that she helped." Samuel's hand tightened on the knife again. "Then don't let them punish her too badly. You owe me that much." "I owe you nothing," Whitmore replied, but there was no conviction in the words. They both knew that in this moment, in this cabin, the natural order had been inverted. Whitmore was the one in debt. Samuel left the cabin, closing the door behind him. The sunlight felt different now, still burning, still painful on his skin, but no longer the light of captivity. Whitmore's horse, a strong bay gelding, waited patiently. Samuel untied it, checked the saddlebags. There was bread, cheese, dried meat, and a flask of water, enough to get him started. He mounted the horse, feeling the animal's warmth and power beneath him. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply experience this, the sensation of sitting astride a horse, not as someone performing a task for his master, but as a man in control of his own movement, his own direction. Then he turned the horse north and rode. He did not gallop. Galloping would draw attention. would signal emergency or flight. Instead, he maintained a steady trot, moving with purpose but not panic. He followed the stream for a while, then cut east through woods he knew from hunting expeditions. His pale skin, usually such a liability, might actually help now. If anyone saw him at a distance, they might mistake him for a white man traveling on legitimate business. The first hour of freedom felt unreal. Samuel kept expecting to hear pursuit, to see Garrett appear with dogs and fury. But the woods remained quiet except for birdsong and the sound of his horse's hooves on soft earth. The sun moved across the sky, marking time's passage, marking his increasing distance from Whitmore's plantation. By mid-afternoon, Samuel had put perhaps 10 miles between himself and the cabin. He stopped at a creek to let the horse drink and to fill the water flask. His hands shook as he knelt by the stream, and he realized he was crying, not from sadness but from the overwhelming intensity of what he had done. He had defied his master. He had threatened violence. He had bargained like a free man. He had ridden away. He was still crying when he heard the riders approaching. Samuel's tears stopped instantly, replaced by the cold clarity of survival instinct. He could hear at least 3 horses, maybe more, moving through the woods from the south. The sound was still distant, perhaps half a mile, but closing. Had Whitmore broken their agreement immediately? Had Margaret panicked and convinced him to send for Garrett? Or had someone else discovered Samuel's absence sooner than expected? He had no time to puzzle through the possibilities. Samuel grabbed the reins and pulled his horse deeper into the undergrowth, moving away from the creek toward denser forest. The bay gelding resisted slightly. Horses preferred open ground, but Samuel urged it forward with firm pressure. Every step took him farther from the approaching riders, but also made noise that might betray his position. The voices became audible now, though Samuel could not make out words. Male voices, at least 3 distinct speakers, calling to each other with the easy confidence of men who expected to be obeyed. Not Garrett's voice. Samuel was certain of that much. These were different men, probably from a neighboring plantation, possibly just travelers on the road, but any white man encountering an enslaved person alone would ask questions Samuel could not answer safely. He dismounted and led the horse on foot, moving as quietly as possible. His pale skin, so obvious in open sunlight, blended better in the dappled shadows of the forest. He pressed himself against the trunk of a large oak, willing the riders to pass, to continue on their way without investigating the woods too closely. The voices grew louder, then stopped. Samuel heard one of the men say something about watering their horses. His heart hammered against his ribs. If they came to this creek, if they saw his tracks in the mud, if they decided to investigate the forest, but fortune, or perhaps simple laziness, intervened. After a moment of discussion, the riders continued on. Their voices faded gradually, the sound of hoofbeats growing distant until the forest settled back into its natural quiet. Samuel remained frozen against the oak for several minutes longer, hardly breathing, listening for any sign of return. When he was certain they were gone, he allowed himself to move again. His legs trembled with released tension. He had been free for perhaps 3 hours, and already he had nearly been caught. The realization of how precarious his situation was settled over him like a heavy cloak. Every white person he encountered was a potential captor. Every sound might signal pursuit. Every decision, which direction to travel, whether to stay hidden or move quickly, when to rest and when to push forward, could mean the difference between freedom and recapture. Samuel remounted and continued north. He had a vague plan, assembled from fragments of overheard conversations and whispered stories. The Underground Railroad was real, not just a rumor. There were safe houses, sympathetic people who would help escaped enslaved people reach free states. Pennsylvania was the goal, not impossibly distant, but far enough that the journey would test every reserve of strength and cunning he possessed. The afternoon lengthened into evening. Samuel covered perhaps 15 miles total before the failing light forced him to stop. He found a dense thicket well off any traveled path and led his horse into its center. There was barely enough room for both of them, but the concealment was worth the discomfort. Samuel tied the horse securely, hoping it would not make noise in the night. He ate sparingly from Whitmore's supplies. The bread was good, the cheese sharp, the dried meat tough but sustaining. Each bite felt like a small victory, food consumed not because his master permitted it, but because he had taken it, because it was his by right of his own action. But the pleasure was tempered by guilt. Somewhere behind him, Dinah was probably being questioned about his escape. Even if Whitmore kept his word about limiting her punishment, she would suffer for his freedom. Samuel tried not to imagine what Garrett might do to her. The overseer's creativity with violence was legendary. He had once beaten a man nearly to death for looking at him wrong, whatever that meant in Garrett's paranoid imagination. What would he do to the mother of an escaped slave, especially one who had humiliated the plantation by taking the master's horse and supplies? Sleep should have been impossible, but exhaustion overwhelmed fear and guilt. Samuel dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, his hand reaching for the knife that never left his side. The night seemed endless, filled with the rustling of animals and the creaking of trees and his own labored breathing. Dawn came grey and misty. Samuel ate more of Whitmore's food and drank from the water flask. He needed to find another water source soon. The flask would not last more than another day. But first he needed distance. 3 days Whitmore had promised, but Samuel did not trust that promise to hold. Fear or anger, or Margaret's influence, might cause the master to send for the authorities sooner. He rode hard that second day, pushing the horse faster than was wise, but driven by the need to put miles between himself and Virginia. The landscape gradually changed as he traveled, the tobacco plantations giving way to smaller farms, the roads becoming less traveled, the faces he glimpsed at a distance more varied. He saw free black people working their own small plots of land, and the sight filled him with a hunger so intense it was almost physical. That was what he wanted, not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. The ability to work land and keep its fruits, to build a home and know it could not be taken from him, to walk down a road without lowering his eyes, to be called sir instead of boy, to exist as a man rather than as property. By afternoon of the second day, Samuel had covered perhaps 30 miles total. His body ached from riding, his thighs were chafed raw, his back screamed with every jolt. His sunburned skin had begun to blister despite his attempts to stay shaded, but pain was irrelevant. Pain could be endured, capture could not. He was following a narrow trail through dense forest when he heard it, a sound that turned his blood cold. Dogs, not the ordinary barking of farm dogs, but the deep, purposeful baying of hounds on a scent, and they were getting closer. If you're feeling the tension of Samuel's flight, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These stories of resistance need to reach every corner of the world. Samuel kicked the horse into a gallop, abandoning caution for speed. The gelding responded, surging forward with power born of good breeding and adequate rest. But the dogs were faster. Samuel could hear them clearly now, their cries rising in pitch as they closed distance. And behind the dogs, the voices of men urging them forward, promising reward for the capture. The trail opened into a clearing with a small farmhouse and barn. Samuel made a split-second decision and rode straight toward the structures. A woman stood in the doorway of the house, white, middle-aged, her face lined with the hard work of frontier farming. She stared at Samuel with an expression he could not read. "Please," Samuel gasped, pulling the horse to a halt. "I'm being chased. I need help." The woman's eyes went from Samuel's pale face to the expensive horse he rode to the sound of approaching dogs. Her expression hardened. "You're a runaway." It was not a question, but Samuel answered anyway. "Yes, ma'am, I'm running north to freedom." The woman hesitated. Samuel could see the calculation in her eyes. The risk of harboring a fugitive weighed against whatever sympathy she might feel, whatever beliefs she held about the rightness or wrongness of slavery. Behind him, the dogs were perhaps a quarter-mile away now, the sound of their pursuit unmistakable. "The barn," the woman said suddenly. "There's a root cellar beneath the feed room. Hide there. I'll deal with the dogs." Samuel did not wait to question her motives. He dismounted and ran toward the barn, pulling the horse with him. Inside, the familiar smell of hay and manure and leather greeted him. He found the feed room easily. Every barn was laid out similarly, and the trapdoor in its floor. The cellar below was small, dark, and smelled of earth and stored vegetables. Samuel led the horse into the barn's main space, removed the saddle and bridle, and slapped its flank to send it into one of the stalls. With luck, it would look like any other farm horse. Then he climbed down into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut above him and praying that the woman's help was genuine and not a trap. In the absolute darkness of the cellar, Samuel could hear everything. The dogs arrived first, their baying reaching a frenzied pitch as they surrounded the barn. Then the men, at least 4, possibly more, their voices loud with excitement. "He came this way," one voice declared. "Dogs wouldn't lie. He's here somewhere." "Check the barn," another commanded. "And the house. He might have forced the woman to hide him." Footsteps above him, heavy boots on wooden planks. Samuel held his breath, pressed against the earthen wall of the cellar, the knife in his hand, though he knew it would be useless against multiple armed men. If they found him, it was over. He would be dragged back to Whitmore's plantation, or killed on the spot if the men decided a dead runaway was less trouble than a live one. The feed room door banged open. Someone walked across the floor directly above Samuel's head. The trapdoor was visible if anyone looked carefully, but would they look, or would they assume the barn was just a barn? Empty except for the horse they would mistake for the woman's own animal? Nothing here, the voice above Samuel called out. Just an old mare in the stall. Check the house then, came the reply. And question the woman. She must have seen something. The footsteps retreated. Samuel heard the men leave the barn, heard them bang on the farmhouse door, heard the woman's voice responding with something he could not make out. The conversation continued for several minutes. Accusations, denials, threats, protestations of ignorance. Then, incredibly, the sound of the men mounting their horses. Dogs might be confused by the creek, one voice suggested. Trail gets muddy there. Probably crossed water to throw them off. Keep looking, another voice commanded. He's on foot now. Can't have gotten far. The sound of horses and dogs moving away. Silence settling over the farm. Samuel remained in the cellar, not daring to move, not daring to believe they were truly gone. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then the trapdoor opened, and the woman's face appeared in the opening, backlit by the barn's dim interior. They're gone, she said, for now, but they'll be back when they lose the trail. You can't stay here. Samuel climbed out of the cellar, his legs stiff from crouching. Why did you help me? He asked. The woman looked at him with an expression that was equal parts pity and determination. My husband died 2 years ago, she said. Before he passed, he made me promise something. He said, if a runaway ever came to our door, I was to help them. He was a Quaker, believed slavery was a sin. I'm not sure what I believe, but I made him a promise, and I keep my promises. She led Samuel out of the barn and pointed north. There's a town about 15 miles from here called Milford. Ask for the cobbler shop on Main Street. Tell them Hannah sent you. They'll know what it means. Samuel wanted to thank her, to express the gratitude that swelled in his chest, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he simply nodded and turned to collect Whitmore's horse. Leave the horse, Hannah said. It's too fine an animal for a fugitive to be riding. You'll draw attention. Go on foot from here. She was right, though the loss of the horse felt like losing a limb. The animal had carried him this far, had been his means of putting distance between himself and Whitmore's plantation. But it was also recognizable, valuable, a clear sign of theft that would mark Samuel as criminal as well as fugitive. Samuel removed the saddlebags, transferring the remaining food and supplies to a rough sack Hannah provided. He took one last look at the bay gelding, this creature that had served him well and unknowingly participated in his rebellion. Then he turned north and began to walk. The next 2 days were a blur of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Samuel traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in whatever cover he could find. Abandoned buildings, dense thickets. Once in a cemetery among the graves of people who had lived and died with freedoms he could only imagine. His food ran out. He drank from streams and prayed the water would not make him sick. His boots, never designed for this kind of sustained walking, began to fall apart. But he kept moving north, north toward Milford, north toward the cobbler shop, north toward whatever help the Underground Railroad might offer, north toward Pennsylvania and freedom. He reached Milford at dusk on the 4th day of his escape. The town was small, perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a crossroads. Samuel approached carefully, keeping to shadows, watching for any sign of slave catchers or suspicious faces. The cobbler shop was easy to find, a modest storefront with a wooden sign depicting a boot. Samuel waited until full darkness, then approached the shop's rear entrance. He knocked quietly, 3 times as Hannah had instructed. The door opened a crack, and a face peered out, an older black man with gray hair and suspicious eyes. Hannah sent me, Samuel whispered. The man's expression changed immediately. He pulled Samuel inside, bolting the door behind them. You're being hunted, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Samuel replied. I ran from Virginia 4 days ago. They had dogs on me 2 days back. The man studied Samuel's face, taking in his pale skin, his light eyes, his white hair. You're the one, he said slowly, the albino who threatened his master. Words already spread. There's a reward for you. $500. Samuel felt his stomach drop. $500 was an enormous sum. For that kind of money, even sympathetic people might be tempted to betrayal. Will you turn me in? He asked, his hand moving toward the knife. The cobbler smiled grimly. I was enslaved for 40 years before I bought my freedom, he said. I'd sooner cut off my own hand than send another person back into bondage. But you need to understand what you're facing. They're not just looking for you because you ran, they're looking for you because of what you know about Whitmore and the Henley woman. You made powerful enemies." Samuel nodded. He had known this would be the consequence, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. He had not just escaped. He had threatened the social order, had exposed the hypocrisy of men who claimed moral superiority while violating their own codes. They would hunt him not just to reclaim property, but to silence him. "I can hide you for tonight," the cobbler said, "but tomorrow you need to move on. There's a wagon heading north to Pennsylvania. The driver's one of us. He'll take you if you can pay." "I have no money," Samuel admitted. The cobbler studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Your freedom is payment enough," he said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, your real journey begins." Samuel spent that night in a hidden room behind the cobbler's workshop, a space so small he could barely lie down fully, accessible only through a false wall that slid aside to reveal the cramped sanctuary. The air was stale and close, but Samuel had never felt more grateful for shelter. He lay on a thin pallet, his body finally allowed to surrender to exhaustion, and slept deeply for the first time since his escape. He dreamed of Dinah. In the dream, she was young again, the way she must have looked before slavery carved lines into her face and bent her spine with endless labor. She was singing, her voice clear and strong, a song Samuel half remembered from childhood. But when he tried to reach her, she faded like smoke, and he woke with tears on his face and the taste of loss bitter in his mouth. The cobbler brought him food at dawn, cornbread and bacon, luxuries Samuel had not tasted in days. "Eat quickly," the old man instructed. "The wagon leaves in an hour. Driver's name is Ezekiel. He's white, but don't let that worry you. He's been running this route for 3 years, never lost a passenger yet." Samuel ate mechanically, his mind already moving forward to the next challenge. Pennsylvania was still days away, maybe a week depending on weather and route, and even reaching Pennsylvania would not guarantee safety. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could pursue him even in free states, that any black person's freedom was always provisional, always subject to challenge and documentation. "What will you do?" the cobbler asked, watching Samuel eat. "When you reach freedom, I mean, assuming you make it." It was a question Samuel had not allowed himself to consider in detail. Survival had consumed all his mental energy, but now, with food in his belly and temporary safety around him, he let himself imagine. "I'll work," he said slowly. "Whatever work I can find. I'll save money, and someday I'll come back for my mother." The cobbler's expression was kind but sad. "That's a dangerous dream," he said. "Going back south, trying to free someone still enslaved. It's how most people get recaptured. You have to be willing to let go, to build a new life, to accept that some people can't be saved." "I won't accept that," Samuel replied, his voice harder than he intended. "She's my mother. I won't leave her there forever." The cobbler nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "Then you'll need to be smart about it, patient. You can't go charging back into Virginia next month expecting to rescue her. You need time, money, connections. You need to become someone who can't easily be touched by slave catchers. That takes years." Samuel absorbed this advice, understanding its wisdom, even as part of him rebelled against the idea of waiting years. But the cobbler was right. Returning now would be suicide. He needed to establish himself in freedom first, to build resources and knowledge, to plan carefully rather than act impulsively. An hour later, Samuel was hidden beneath a false floor in Ezekiel's wagon, surrounded by the smell of potatoes and onions that served as cover cargo. The space was even more cramped than the cobbler's hidden room, barely allowing Samuel to shift position. But it was movement toward freedom, each mile taking him farther from Virginia and closer to Pennsylvania. The wagon lurched into motion. Samuel could hear Ezekiel's voice above him, calling to his horses, occasionally singing hymns in a surprisingly pleasant tenor. The journey was agonizingly slow. The wagon moved at perhaps 3 miles per hour, stopping frequently at checkpoints and toll roads where authorities might inspect cargo and ask questions. At the first checkpoint, Samuel heard voices above him, official and suspicious. "What's your business?" a man demanded. "Delivering vegetables to Pittsburgh," Ezekiel replied, his voice easy and unconcerned. "Got a contract with a hotel there. They pay good money for quality produce. Mind if I take a look?" "Help yourself," Ezekiel said, and Samuel heard footsteps around the wagon, the rustle of sacks being moved. His heart hammered so loudly he was certain the inspector could hear it. But the false floor held, the potatoes and onions concealing the more valuable cargo beneath. "Seems in order," the inspector finally said. "Move along." The wagon continued. Samuel released a breath he had not realized he was holding. They repeated this scenario 3 more times that day, Each inspection a fresh terror, each successful passage a small miracle. By evening, when Ezekiel finally stopped at a barn and opened the false floor to let Samuel out, Samuel's body was so stiff he could barely move. "We're making good time," Ezekiel said, helping Samuel climb out. "2 more days and we'll be in Pennsylvania. But we need to talk about what comes after." They sat in the barn while Ezekiel explained the reality of life as a fugitive in a free state. Samuel would need papers, forged documents claiming he was a free black man born in Pennsylvania or New York. He would need a new name, a manufactured history, a plausible story to explain his presence and pale appearance. He would need to avoid any situation that might bring him to the attention of authorities who could question his status. "Your skin will actually help," Ezekiel said, studying Samuel's pale face in the lamplight. "Most people see a white-skinned person. They don't immediately think runaway slave. You can pass for white if you're careful, if you don't spend too much time around black communities where the contrast would be obvious." The suggestion made Samuel uncomfortable. Pass for white? Deny his connection to the people he had lived among his entire life? The community that had sustained him, even as his difference isolated him? It felt like betrayal. But Ezekiel was not suggesting betrayal. He was suggesting survival. "I know it sits wrong," the driver said gently, "but you have to think practically. You want to help your mother someday. You need to stay free long enough to accumulate the resources, and that means using every advantage you have, including the accident of your appearance." Samuel spent the night in the barn, wrestling with this advice. He understood its logic, but something in him resisted. His pale skin had always been a source of pain and isolation. The idea of using it as a tool felt like accepting the very racial categories that justified slavery in the first place. The notion that whiteness conveyed privilege and safety, while blackness meant vulnerability and bondage. But what choice did he have? Principle was a luxury he could not afford. Survival required compromise, required using the system's own tools against it. If his pale skin could protect him, could keep him free long enough to eventually help Dinah, then using that protection was not betrayal. It was strategy. The next day's travel was similar to the first. Long hours cramped beneath the false floor, stops at checkpoints, inspections that made Samuel's blood run cold. But each successful passage increased his confidence that he might actually reach Pennsylvania, that freedom might actually be possible. On the afternoon of the second day in Ezekiel's wagon, disaster struck. They had stopped at a checkpoint where a new inspector was on duty, younger than the previous ones, more thorough, more suspicious. Samuel could hear him questioning Ezekiel closely about his route, his cargo, his destination. Then, horrifyingly, he heard the inspector say, "I'm going to need to unload some of this. Had reports of smuggling on this route." Above Samuel, the sacks of vegetables began to move. The inspector was being systematic, removing cargo layer by layer, and would inevitably reach the false floor that concealed Samuel. There was no time to run, nowhere to hide. Samuel pulled out his knife, knowing it was useless but unable to face capture without some means of resistance. Then Ezekiel's voice, sharp with offense. "You calling me a smuggler? I've been running this route for years. Never had a problem. You're new here, aren't you? Don't know the regular drivers? Well, let me tell you something, boy." The tone was perfect. Offended dignity, mixed with contempt for the inspector's youth and inexperience. Samuel could almost see Ezekiel puffing himself up, playing the role of the indignant honest merchant, being harassed by an overzealous official. "I'm not calling you anything," the inspector said, sounding less certain now. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to inspect cargo, not tear apart a man's entire load because you're trying to impress your supervisor," Ezekiel shot back. "You know how long it'll take me to reload all this? I'll miss my delivery window. Hotel in Pittsburgh won't pay if the vegetables arrive late and wilted. You want to explain to your boss why you cost me my contract over nothing?" There was a long pause. Samuel could feel the balance tipping, the inspector's resolve weakening under Ezekiel's aggressive confidence. "Fine," the young man finally said, "but I'm making a note of this. If there are any problems—" "There won't be," Ezekiel interrupted, "because I'm a legitimate businessman, not some criminal you're trying to catch to make yourself look good." The wagon moved on. Samuel lay in the darkness beneath the false floor, his heart racing, his gratitude toward Ezekiel overwhelming. The driver had just saved his life through nothing more than bravado and manipulation of social expectations. It was a masterclass in how to work within oppressive systems while subverting them. That night, they crossed into Pennsylvania. Samuel did not know the exact moment it happened, There was no dramatic sign, no change in the landscape or air. But Ezekiel told him when he opened the false floor that evening, "You're in a free state now. Doesn't mean you're safe, but it means something." Samuel climbed out of the wagon and stood on Pennsylvania soil. The earth felt no different beneath his feet. The sky looked the same, but something inside him shifted. A knot of tension he had carried for 25 years loosened slightly. Not gone, not resolved, but less tight. "What now?" Samuel asked. Ezekiel handed him a small bundle. Clothes, a pair of decent boots, and a leather document case. Papers inside say you're Samuel Freeman, born free in Philadelphia in 1831. If anyone asks, you're traveling to Pittsburgh to look for work as a clerk. Your light skin is explained by mixed parentage. Father was white, mother was black, both deceased. Can you read and write? Samuel nodded. Whitmore had taught him, viewing Samuel's literacy as part of his scientific experiment, wanting to test whether an enslaved person could master such skills. The irony was sharp. His master's curiosity had given Samuel tools that would help him stay free. "Good," Ezekiel said. "That makes the Clark story believable. I'm taking you to a boarding house in Pittsburgh. Owner's sympathetic. She'll house you for a week while you look for work. After that, you're on your own." The final leg of the journey took another day. They approached Pittsburgh as the sun set, the city appearing through industrial haze, factories and mills belching smoke, the rivers crowded with barges and steamboats. It was loud, dirty, overwhelming after the rural landscape Samuel had known his entire life. But it was also full of opportunity, full of anonymity, full of people who did not know his history or care about his origins. The boarding house was in a working-class neighborhood, squeezed between a cooperage and a blacksmith shop. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was a Chinese immigrant who asked no questions when Ezekiel introduced Samuel as Freeman. She showed him to a small room on the 3rd floor, barely larger than a closet but clean and private, with a window that looked out over the street. "Rent's due every Saturday," Mrs. Chen said. "You find work, you pay. You don't find work, you leave. Understood?" "Understood," Samuel replied. Ezekiel left that night having other fugitives to transport, other desperate people to guide toward freedom. Before he departed, he shook Samuel's hand. "You're smart and you're brave," the driver said. "Those qualities will serve you well. But remember, staying free is harder than getting free. Never forget that you're always one mistake away from being captured." Samuel nodded, committing this wisdom to memory. Then he was alone in his small room, truly alone for the first time in his life. No overseer would wake him at dawn. No master would summon him for examination. No one would tell him where to go or what to do. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. He spent his first night of freedom lying awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city. Factory whistles, street vendors, the rumble of wagons on cobblestones. Somewhere in Virginia, Dinah was probably lying awake too, wondering if her son was alive or dead, free or recaptured. Samuel sent a silent promise into the darkness. "I will come back for you. I don't know when or how, but I will come back." The next morning, Samuel began his new life. He found work within 3 days, a clerk position at a shipping company that asked few questions and cared only about his ability to read, write, and calculate figures. The work was tedious, but paid enough to cover his rent and food, with a little left over for saving. He adopted the habits of a free man, walking down the street with his head up, entering buildings through front doors rather than back, being addressed as Mr. Freeman rather than boy. But he never forgot he was playing a role. Samuel Freeman, freeborn clerk, was a fiction necessary for survival. Underneath remained the man who had been Samuel the slave, Samuel the curiosity, Samuel the son of Dinah. That man could not rest, could not fully relax into his new identity because that man had made a promise. Months passed. Samuel saved every penny he could spare. He made careful inquiries about abolition networks, about people who helped enslaved people escape, about the logistics and costs of rescue operations. He learned that freeing someone still enslaved was enormously difficult and expensive, requiring paid accomplices, forged papers, bribery, and careful planning. The amount he needed to save was staggering, the timeline measured in years rather than months. But Samuel was patient. He had learned patience through 25 years of slavery. He could wait, he could plan, and eventually he would return for Dinah. In the meantime, he lived. He made acquaintances, if not quite friends. He attended church services at a black congregation, where his pale skin drew curious looks but no hostility. He read newspapers voraciously, following debates about slavery, tracking which states were becoming more or less hostile to black people, monitoring for any news from Virginia. And one day, nearly a year after his escape, he saw an article that made his blood run cold. The headline read, "Virginia plantation owner dead in apparent murder-suicide." The article described how Robert Whitmore had been found dead in his study, shot through the head with his own pistol. His wife had been found in their bedroom, also shot dead. The article speculated about financial troubles, about debts Whitmore had been unable to pay, about the shame that might have driven a man to kill his wife and then himself. But Samuel knew better. He thought about Margaret Henley, about the affair that had given him leverage, about the secret that powerful men would kill to protect. Had Charles Henley discovered the truth? Had he taken revenge? Or had Whitmore's guilt and fear finally consumed him? The article made no mention of an escaped slave, no connection to Samuel's flight a year earlier, but Samuel wondered if his escape had set in motion a chain of events that led to this violent end. His blackmail had kept Whitmore silent about the affair, but only temporarily. Eventually, the truth must have emerged. And eventually, someone had paid the ultimate price. Samuel felt no satisfaction at Whitmore's death, no joy, no sense of justice served, only a hollow awareness that violence bred more violence, that the system of slavery corrupted everyone it touched, enslaved and enslaver alike. Whitmore had been a man who measured skulls and recorded characteristics, who treated human beings as specimens for study. He had been cruel in the casual way that power permitted, but he had also been a man trapped in his own system, unable to see its fundamental evil, because acknowledging that evil would require acknowledging his own participation in it. Now, Whitmore was dead, and his wife was dead, and somewhere in Virginia other people continued to be bought and sold and worked to death in fields that turned human suffering into tobacco and cotton and profit. Samuel folded the newspaper carefully and returned to work. He had survived. He was free, and someday, when he had saved enough money and made enough connections and planned carefully enough, he would fulfill his promise to Dinah. The story was not over. It had only just begun. Block 5. 3 years passed before Samuel felt ready to attempt what he had promised. 3 years of clerking at the shipping company, of living frugally in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, of saving every possible dollar. 3 years of careful networking within Pittsburgh's black community, of learning who could be trusted and who could not, of understanding the complex machinery of the Underground Railroad from the perspective of someone who had once been its cargo. Samuel was 28 now, no longer the desperate fugitive who had arrived in Pennsylvania with nothing but borrowed clothes and forged papers. He had built a life, modest but stable, precarious but functional. He had friends, or at least friendly acquaintances. He had a reputation as reliable and hard-working. He had accumulated nearly $300, a sum that represented countless hours of labor and denial. But he had not forgotten. Every day, he thought of Dinah. Every night before sleep claimed him, he renewed his promise. And now, finally, he had the resources and connections to attempt her rescue. The plan began with information. Samuel paid a black sailor, a free man who traveled regularly between Pittsburgh and Virginia ports, to make inquiries in Henrico County. What had happened to Dinah after Samuel's escape? Was she still alive? Was she still on what remained of Whitmore's plantation? Or had she been sold after the master's death? The news, when it came 2 months later, was both better and worse than Samuel had feared. Dinah was alive. She was 53 years old, still relatively healthy despite decades of hard labor, but she was no longer on Whitmore's former plantation. After Robert Whitmore's death, his estate had been liquidated to pay debts. The plantation had been sold to a consortium of investors who divided the land. The enslaved people had been auctioned off individually. Dinah had been purchased by a man named Thomas Crane, a merchant who owned a small farm outside Richmond. Crane was known as a harsh master who worked his enslaved people brutally and tolerated no infractions. He had bought Dinah cheaply. She was considered old for field work and used her primarily for cooking and cleaning in his household. Samuel absorbed this information with a mixture of relief and rage. His mother was alive, but she was in the hands of a man known for cruelty. Every day she remained enslaved was another day of suffering he could not prevent. The urgency of rescue pressed against him like a physical weight. He began to plan in earnest. Simply showing up in Virginia and trying to take Dinah would be suicide. Samuel was still a fugitive, still subject to recapture if recognized. He needed a more sophisticated approach, one that relied on deception and misdirection rather than force. Through his Underground Railroad connections, Samuel met a man named Jacob Morris, a white abolitionist from Philadelphia, who had successfully orchestrated several rescue operations. Morris was in his 40s, well-dressed and educated, able to move through Southern society without raising suspicion. He agreed to help Samuel, though he made clear the risks. "Even if we succeed in getting her out," Morris warned, "the journey north will be dangerous. She's older, probably not in the best health. The strain of travel, of hiding, of constant fear, it might be too much." "She's strong," Samuel insisted, though he had no way of knowing if this was still true. 3 years and a change of ownership might have broken what decades on Whitmore's plantation had not. "And if we're caught," Morris continued, "you'll be captured and returned to slavery. I'll probably be arrested, maybe imprisoned. We need to be absolutely certain this is worth the risk." Samuel met Morris's eyes. "She's my mother. That makes it worth any risk." Morris nodded slowly. "Then we'll need at least $200 for bribes and expenses. Can you manage that?" Samuel could, barely. It would consume most of his savings, leaving him with almost nothing if the rescue failed. But money was meaningless compared to Dinah's freedom. He handed over the funds without hesitation. The plan they developed was complex, relying on timing and deception. Morris would travel to Richmond posing as a slave trader looking to purchase domestic servants for a wealthy family in Baltimore. He would approach Thomas Crane with an offer to buy Dinah, claiming she had been recommended for her cooking skills. Once the purchase was complete and papers signed, Morris would take Dinah north, supposedly to Baltimore but actually to Pennsylvania. It was not foolproof. Crane might refuse to sell. Someone might recognize Morris from previous rescue operations. The papers might not pass scrutiny at checkpoints. Dinah herself might not trust Morris, might refuse to go with a white stranger claiming to be her purchaser. 100 things could go wrong, but Samuel had learned that freedom always required risk. Safety was an illusion, security a fantasy. The only certainty was that doing nothing guaranteed Dinah would die enslaved. Morris left for Virginia in September 1859. Samuel remained in Pittsburgh, working at the shipping company as if nothing unusual was happening, while internally consumed with anxiety. Every day without word was agony. Every possible disaster played out in his imagination. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Samuel began to fear the worst, that Morris had been caught, that Dinah was dead, that his attempt at rescue had brought only more suffering. Then, on a cold October morning, Samuel answered a knock at his boarding house door and found Morris standing there, exhausted and travel-worn, and behind him, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill, stood Dinah. For a moment Samuel could not move. 3 years had passed since he had seen his mother, and those years showed in the silver that now dominated her hair, the deeper lines around her eyes, the way she stood slightly bent as if her spine could no longer straighten fully. But her eyes were the same, dark and fierce and full of a strength that slavery had never broken. "Samuel," she whispered, as if afraid he might be an apparition. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms. She felt smaller than he remembered, frailer, but she held him with surprising strength. They stood like that for a long moment, neither speaking, both crying, both feeling the weight of 3 years of separation dissolve into the reality of reunion. Morris cleared his throat gently. "We should get inside. Less conspicuous that way." They moved into Samuel's small room. Morris explained what had happened. Crane had been willing to sell, eager even. Seeing an opportunity to make a profit on an enslaved woman, he considered past her prime usefulness. The transaction had been straightforward, the papers properly executed. The journey north had been tense, but ultimately uneventful. Dinah had played her role perfectly, acting as a newly purchased servant traveling with her new owner. "She knew," Morris said, looking at Dinah with respect. "The moment I mentioned your name, she understood, never questioned, never hesitated, just said she was ready to go." Dinah spoke for the first time, her voice rougher than Samuel remembered, but steady. "I knew you'd come back. I told them, told everyone who would listen. My son escaped and he'll come back for me someday. Some people thought I was crazy, holding on to hope like that, but I knew." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm sorry it took so long," he managed to say. "I wanted to come sooner, but I needed money and—" "Hush," Dinah interrupted, touching his face with her worn hand. "You're here now. I'm here now. That's all that matters." Morris stayed for a few more hours, ensuring Dinah was settled and explaining the logistics of her new life. She would need papers claiming she was a free black woman, similar to Samuel's forged documents. She would need to learn Pittsburgh's geography and social landscape. She would need to be careful, always aware that her freedom was fragile and conditional. Before Morris left, he pulled Samuel aside. "What you did, planning this rescue, saving for years, never giving up, that takes extraordinary determination. Your mother is lucky to have a son like you." Samuel shook his head. "I'm the lucky one. She gave me life. I just gave her freedom." After Morris departed, Samuel and Dinah sat together in the small room, catching up on 3 years of separation. She told him about life after his escape, how Garrett had beaten her savagely when Samuel went missing, how she had been questioned repeatedly about whether she had helped him, how the other enslaved people had protected her as much as they could with their silence. She described the auction after Whitmore's death, how it felt to stand on a platform while men examined her teeth and muscles, debating her worth in dollars and cents. She spoke of Thomas Crane's household, of the endless work and casual cruelty, of the way hope had sustained her, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Samuel told her about his journey north, about Hannah and the cobbler and Ezekiel, about his new life as Samuel Freeman the clerk, about the daily challenge of maintaining his false identity while never forgetting who he really was. "Your father would be proud," Dinah said suddenly. Samuel looked at her in surprise. She had rarely spoken of his father, an enslaved man on a neighboring plantation who had been sold away when Samuel was an infant. "You never talk about him." "Because it hurt too much," Dinah admitted. "He was a good man, loving. He used to say that someday we'd all be free, that slavery couldn't last forever. I thought he was foolish for believing that, but maybe he was right. Maybe we're seeing the beginning of the end." She was referring to the growing tensions between North and South, the increasing violence over the slavery question, the sense that the nation was careening toward some kind of rupture. Samuel followed these developments closely through newspapers, aware that war might be coming, uncertain whether war would bring liberation or just more suffering for enslaved people caught in the middle. "What will you do now?" Samuel asked. "I mean, in Pittsburgh, we'll need to find you work, somewhere to live. This room is too small for both of us." Dinah smiled, the expression transforming her worn face. "I'll manage. I've been managing my whole life. Finding work in a free city sounds easy compared to surviving slavery." She was right, though the reality proved more challenging than either anticipated. Work for an older black woman in Pittsburgh was limited, mostly domestic service, laundry, cooking for boarding houses and hotels. Dinah found employment with a church that needed someone to clean and prepare meals for their charitable programs. The pay was minimal, barely enough to rent a tiny room in a building even more cramped than Mrs. Chen's boarding house, but it was work she chose, money she earned, a room she rented rather than a space she was confined to. These distinctions, seemingly minor, were everything. For the first time in 53 years, Dinah controlled her own labor, her own time, her own choices. Samuel visited her every Sunday after church services. They would share a simple meal, usually something Dinah had cooked from her meager earnings, and talk about the week's events. Sometimes they reminisced about people they had known on Whitmore's plantation, wondering who was still alive, who had been sold away, who had escaped or died or simply endured. Other times they talked about the future. Dinah wanted Samuel to marry, to have children, to build the family life that slavery had denied them. Samuel was less certain. Marriage meant vulnerability, meant more people who could be hurt if his fugitive status was ever exposed. But he did not dismiss the idea entirely. Perhaps someday, when the political situation stabilized, when the constant threat of recapture diminished, he could imagine building that kind of life. The months after Dinah's rescue were perhaps the happiest of Samuel's life. Not perfect. Freedom for black people in 1859 was never perfect, always conditional, always shadowed by the possibility of violence or recapture. But better than anything he had known before, he had his mother, he had work, he had a community, he had hope. Then came John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859, just weeks after Dinah's arrival in Pittsburgh. The news electrified the nation. A white abolitionist and his followers, including several black men, had attempted to seize a federal armory, planning to arm enslaved people and spark a general uprising. The raid failed. Brown was captured and executed, but the reverberations were profound. In the South, paranoia about slave rebellions reached fever pitch. Enslaved people were watched more carefully, punished more severely for any perceived insubordination. The Underground Railroad became more dangerous as southern states increased patrols and checkpoints. In the North, the incident polarized opinion. Some saw Brown as a martyr, a righteous warrior against the evil of slavery. Others condemned him as a terrorist, whose violence would only make the situation worse. The political center collapsed, positions hardened, and the nation lurched closer to the war that many had predicted, but few truly wanted. Samuel watched these developments with mixed emotions. Part of him admired Brown's willingness to use violence against slavery, to take direct action rather than relying on moral persuasion or political process. But he also understood that Brown's raid had probably made life worse for enslaved people in the short term, had triggered reprisals, and increased surveillance. "Do you think it's coming?" Dinah asked one Sunday, as they sat in her small room reading newspaper accounts of Brown's execution. "The war everyone's talking about?" "Yes," Samuel said. "I don't know when, but it's coming. Too much anger on both sides. Too many people convinced they're absolutely right, and their opponents are absolutely evil. What will happen to us?" Dinah asked. "If there's war?" Samuel had no answer. A war between North and South could mean liberation for millions of enslaved people, or it could mean increased danger for fugitives like himself and Dinah, caught between competing armies and ideologies. There was no way to predict how events would unfold, no way to guarantee safety. "We'll survive," Samuel finally said, "like we always have. We'll adapt and endure and find ways to keep going." Dinah nodded slowly. "Your father used to say something similar. He said enslaved people were the strongest people in the world because we survived what would break anyone else. I didn't believe him then, thought he was just trying to make the unbearable feel bearable. But maybe he was right." The winter of 1859-1860 passed in an atmosphere of increasing tension. The presidential election was coming, and everyone understood it would be decisive. Samuel followed the campaign closely, understanding that his future and the future of millions like him might depend on its outcome. When Abraham Lincoln won in November 1860, Samuel felt a cautious optimism. Lincoln opposed slavery's expansion, though not its immediate abolition, but Southern states interpreted his election as an existential threat and began to secede. By spring of 1861, war seemed inevitable. Samuel and Dinah discussed whether they should leave Pittsburgh, move farther north to Canada, where slavery had been abolished and fugitives were safer. But leaving felt like retreat, like abandoning the community that had sheltered them. They decided to stay to face whatever came together. If this story of courage and reunion has moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what stories of resistance you'd like to hear next. These histories matter. Your engagement helps keep them alive and ensures more people can discover the incredible resilience of those who fought for freedom against impossible odds. The war came in April 1861. Fort Sumter fell, and the nation tore itself apart. Samuel watched young men march off to battle, some enthusiastically, believing they fought for noble causes, others reluctantly caught up in forces beyond their control. He wondered if he should enlist, if he should fight for the Union cause, but his fugitive status made that impossible. He could not risk the scrutiny that military service would bring. Instead, he continued his quiet work, clerking at the shipping company, saving money, helping other fugitives who passed through Pittsburgh on their way to Canada. He became more active in the Underground Railroad, using his salary to support safe houses and pay for forged documents. He could not fight with weapons, but he could fight by undermining slavery's infrastructure, by helping people escape, by making freedom possible one person at a time. Dinah continued her work at the church. As the war progressed and casualties mounted, the church began organizing aid for wounded soldiers, black soldiers especially, who were often denied proper medical care. Dinah helped cook meals and prepare bandages, contributing in her own way to the war effort. Years passed. The war ground on, bloody and brutal. Samuel read about battles with names that would become famous: Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg. He followed Lincoln's gradual evolution on slavery, from preservation of the Union as the primary goal to emancipation as a war measure. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January 1863, Samuel and Dinah attended a celebration at their church, where people sang and prayed and cried with joy at this first official step toward the freedom they had always claimed as their natural right. But Samuel understood that proclamations were not the same as reality. Slavery still existed in border states not covered by the proclamation. Enslaved people in the Confederacy would remain in bondage until Union armies reached them, and even after legal emancipation, the battle for true equality would continue, perhaps forever. In April 1865, the war ended. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the Confederacy collapsed. Samuel was 34 years old, his mother was 59, and they were among 4 million black people who could now claim freedom not as fugitives, but as citizens protected by law. Samuel and Dinah stood together in Pittsburgh's streets as news of the surrender spread. Around them, people celebrated. White and black, rich and poor, all united momentarily in relief that the slaughter had ended. But Samuel and Dinah's celebration was tempered by awareness of how much had been lost, how many had died, how long and difficult the road ahead would be. "We survived," Dinah said quietly, taking Samuel's hand. "We made it to this moment." Samuel squeezed her hand gently, feeling the weight of everything that phrase encompassed. They had survived slavery. They had survived escape and pursuit and the constant threat of recapture. They had survived separation and reunion. They had survived a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands and reshaped the nation. And now they would survive whatever came next: Reconstruction, the struggle for civil rights, the ongoing battle against racism and exploitation, because that was what they did. That was what their people had always done. They survived. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The nation plunged into mourning, and Samuel felt the loss personally, despite never having met the president. Lincoln had been flawed, had moved too slowly on emancipation, had prioritized union over justice, but he had ultimately chosen the right side of history, had issued the proclamation that began the legal dismantling of slavery. Samuel attended a memorial service at his church, where the pastor spoke of Lincoln's martyrdom and the unfinished work that remained. The pastor reminded the congregation that freedom was not a destination but a journey, that legal emancipation was only the beginning, that true equality would require generations of struggle. Samuel knew the pastor was right. His own story proved it. Even in freedom, he remained Samuel Freeman, a man with forged papers and a false history, unable to reclaim his true identity without risking consequences. Even in freedom, Dinah worked for wages that barely sustained her, living in a room hardly better than the cabin she had occupied as an enslaved woman. Even in freedom, black people faced discrimination, violence, exclusion from full participation in American society, but they also had hope. They had each other. They had a community of people who had survived the unsurvivable, who had maintained their humanity in conditions designed to destroy it, who had never stopped believing that freedom was their natural right. Samuel thought back to that day in the cabin, when he had confronted Whitmore with a knife and demanded his mother's freedom. He had been terrified then, uncertain whether he would survive the day, but he had acted anyway, had claimed agency in a system designed to deny him any choice. That moment had started everything: his escape, his journey north, his years of planning and saving, Dinah's eventual rescue. One moment of resistance had changed 2 lives completely, and across the South, similar moments were happening now on a massive scale. 4 million people claiming freedom, testing its boundaries, discovering what it meant to own their own labor and make their own choices. Some would succeed beyond imagination. Others would struggle and fail and be ground down by systems that evolved to maintain white supremacy in freedom, as they had in slavery. But all would contribute to the ongoing story of black survival and resistance and hope. Samuel and Dinah were part of that story. Not heroes, just 2 people who had endured and adapted and refused to surrender their humanity. Their story was extraordinary only in its particulars. In its essence, in its core of survival and love and determination, it was utterly ordinary, repeated millions of times across generations. And that, Samuel understood, was both humbling and empowering. He was not alone. His struggles and triumphs were part of something larger than himself. His mother's freedom was not just a personal victory, but a small contribution to the collective liberation of their people. Years later, when Samuel was old and Dinah was gone, he would tell this story to younger people who had never known slavery firsthand. He would try to help them understand what it had been like, why freedom meant what it did, why vigilance was necessary because rights once gained could be lost again. But on this day in April 1865, Samuel simply stood with his mother in the streets of Pittsburgh and let himself feel what he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Not just hope, not just relief, but joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at being alive, at being free, at being together. The albino slave who had terrified his master was gone. In his place stood Samuel Freeman, a black man with pale skin and a complicated history, a survivor who had helped his mother survive, a fragment of the great story of black freedom in America. And that story, Imperfect and ongoing was enough.